welcome to the Soul of Seton, a brand new podcast brought to you by Seton Hall Campus Ministry. As you'd imagine, we're coming to you from the campus of Seton Hall University, named after the first American-born saint, Saint Elizabeth Ann Seton, located just about an hour outside New York City. I am your host, Matthew Pearson. I am a seminarian here from the Diocese of Madison, Wisconsin. Go Packers while we're at it. The goal of this podcast, we want to make sure we're bringing you some fresh insights from the philosophy department and the theology department here on campus. And joining us to talk about our first inaugural episode, Bible Fairy Tales, Dr. Jeffrey Morrow. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you so much
for
having me.
We talked about this before the show, before we started the podcast. We talked about Adam and Eve, the serpent, you talk about Noah's Ark, Jonah and the whale, all these kind of mythological kind of stories of the Bible. There's a lot to get into with those, but in a certain sense, because of we are post-Jesus resurrection, if you don't believe that, the other ones don't matter.
That's right. Well, first of all, I'd say I wouldn't consider these fairy tales. That's obviously you don't either.
Of course.
But I think the issue with regard to the mythological reading of any passage of the Bible primarily comes out of this kind of secularization where people don't believe in the supernatural, they don't believe in miracles, they don't believe in God, or if they believe in God, it's a God that's off in the distance that started things off. So if there are no miracles, well, obviously Jesus couldn't have risen from the dead. That doesn't happen. I don't know people. Know people have died, but I don't know anybody that's come back from the dead. So what they do then is they look at comparable mythology, look at other stories that might be similar. Now, the most famous of this was The Golden Bough by James Frazer. And what he did at the end of the 19th century is he went about to look at ancient religious traditions, particularly in the Middle East, but elsewhere as well, to see if he could explain away Jesus' resurrection by looking at other examples of dying and rising gods.
So we're talking about I know there's the Egyptian,
that's right.
the Eye of Horus, there's Babylonian Osiris.
That's right. There's a lot. He examined a lot of examples. There's a lot of problems with this. I actually worked with an ancient historian, Edwin Yamauchi, at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And Yamauchi wrote a very famous article that's actually available online. It's called Easter, Myth, Hallucination, or History. And in his section on myth, he summarizes for a more popular audience the arguments he's made elsewhere about these other mythological texts. And what he shows is that there's a lot of differences, first of all, that people don't take into account. The first thing is, when you look at most of these ancient Near Eastern stories concerning some sort of a dying and rising God, the first thing to notice is they're not physical. The resurrections are purely spiritual. That's very important.
And that's how they depict them in
the texts. And so when they sometimes you'll hear scholars like Frazer would say that they eat food. Well, that's not actually accurate. When you look at the texts, at most they're a spirit that looks like it's risen.
Sure.
And they may smell the aroma, but there's no actually consuming of the food.
Okay. And
that's important because in Judaism, the concept of resurrection was fairly widespread by Jesus' day. Mm-hmm. And that was the tradition that was bequeathed to the rabbis. The early rabbis would go to the Torah, the first 5 books, where there really are no explicit references to resurrection. And they would argue that if you do not think you can find and argue for the resurrection in the Torah alone, the first 5 books, you won't participate in the resurrection. You won't be risen. And so when we look at Judaism, Jewish expectations of a resurrection were bodily and physical. That was very important.
Okay.
And if we look at the descriptions of our Lord when he's risen from the dead, they're all bodily and physical.
I mean, I think the gospel writers go out of their way to really make the point that he ate with them. He consumed food. He drank wine, et cetera, et cetera.
That's right.
That's I want to transition quick into some of the historical stuff.
Sure.
So, because I've gotten into different arguments with atheist friends of mine or whatnot about they'll deny this idea that Jesus even existed or the resurrection. I mean, the resurrection, I don't understand how it can be construed as a fairy tale or even a myth when, we have historical writings of Roman Jewish historians who said that, there's people that believe this happened.
That's right.
And there's in fact, there was just a movie that came out, maybe a year or so ago. I believe it's a Protestant movie, but talking about the search for the body of Christ, because there was this insurrection of the Jews, and they're saying, well, if we find the body, this will get rid of their myth.
Right.
But it never happened. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, certainly. I mean, this is part of my own conversion process. I grew up as an agnostic Jew and became a Protestant before becoming Catholic, and a lot of it was investigating the historical background of the resurrection. It's very difficult to argue Jesus didn't exist. You're not going to find many historians that will do that. I mean, even the more skeptical, like John Dominic Crossan, will concede he obviously existed, and then he'll try to wish away what happened to the body. And it's very difficult to argue against a burial in an empty tomb. Right? The great Jewish scholar Geza Vermesh, in his 1970s book, 1973, 74, something like that, Jesus the Jew, he wrote that, quote, "In the end, when every argument has been considered and weighed, the only explanation acceptable to the historian is that the women who set out to pay their last respects to Jesus found to their consternation not a body, but an empty tomb." And so the circumstantial evidence is fairly strong. We know he died on a cross. We have that attested outside the Bible from the first century, like in Josephus, the Jewish historian. We know that he was buried. We know that was what was done for Jewish individuals, including crucifixion victims. The one archaeological bit of evidence we have is Yehochanan. He was crucified, and he was given not only an initial burial, but a secondary burial for his family. And we have the bone box we discovered with his calcaneus, his heel bone, with a nail still stuck in it from crucifixion. So we know Jesus would have been buried, and we know that the tomb was empty. And the Jewish polemic early on with the Jewish Christians and the Jews who did not follow Jesus understood that, because they argued that Jesus did not rise from the dead. The disciples said he did. The tomb is empty. And the Jewish interlocutors didn't deny that.
Yeah.
They didn't say, no, it's not, it's still there. Instead, they said, you stole the body.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets difficult.
I've heard there was one of the Roman soldiers who was been guarding the tomb. Had that been an actual thing where they were robbed, where they were supposed to guard this tomb, and they were bamboozled by these Jews who came to steal the body. Had that happened legitimately, those Roman guards would have been killed.
That's right. They would have been stripped in their clothing and burned in their own clothing.
Yeah, this would have been, this would have been a dereliction of duty.
That's right.
And that didn't actually happen because there was something about their story that told them that something bizarre happened here.
That's right. And it's not only the mechanism, the removal of the body, that's difficult, because then you have to convince people that he's alive still.
Yeah.
Because St. Paul and others were converted after the resurrection. So that's one thing. But the difficulty really becomes the motive. If the body was stolen, why? Grave robbers don't steal bodies, they steal treasure. If the Romans or the Jews had stolen the body, Christianity would have never gotten off the ground, because they would have said, he didn't rise from the dead.
Here's the body.
Here's the body.
Yeah,
but they couldn't do that. If the disciples had stolen the body, for what motive? Right? As, again, Yamauchi said, they had everything to lose and nothing to gain. They were tortured to death for claiming that Jesus rose from the dead. Nobody dies for a lie. People die all the time for things that are not true, but they believe they're true.
Yeah.
But if the disciples had known that what they were saying was not true because they had stolen the body, they wouldn't have died for that. Bartholomew wouldn't have allowed himself to be skinned alive.
Yeah.
He would have said, whoa, I was just joking. I stole the body. Take those knives away.
So, final thought, practical advice for someone, atheist, agnostic, what's a good path for them to take? Because this is the question.
Yeah.
Did he rise or didn't he? And if he did, how are you going to react to that?
That's right.
How are you going to find faith? How are you going to, enter the church? How are you going to do all these things? But where should they start?
I would read some of the arguments about this. I would read, like, Brant Petrie has a great book, The Case for Jesus. It's fantastic. I would start there with Brant Petrie's book, The Case for Jesus, as he goes through the evidence for Jesus as well as the resurrection.
Well, that's probably going to do it for our inaugural podcast. You have fun? I had fun.
Excellent.
Yeah,
thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being here. Real quick, just for people to find out where we're going to be at. Obviously, the first thing with the podcast is it's our first one, so we need your help spreading it around. So check us out on Facebook, facebook.com, Seton Hall Campus Ministry. Also, facebook.com, Soul of Seton. We also have a blog, blogs.shu.edu/campus ministry. And we're also going to have the podcast on SoundCloud and hopefully coming soon to iTunes very soon. You have to get a couple things submitted. So, Dr. Morrow, once again, thank you so much for joining us. Definitely.
It's a pleasure.
And I will leave our lovely audience with the words of our patroness, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. We know certainly that our God calls us to a holy life. Until next time, God bless you.